This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast.
Hey guys, how's everyone doing?
Yay! All right, so today we're going to talk about... Oh, wait, this is your job.
That's my job. I'm supposed to
That's your
say.
job. You always say it. I feel like I'm already messing up.
Well,
All right,
usually you
This is
set
you.
me up for it. You usually set me up for
My
it.
bad. I totally didn't set you up for it. All right, go ahead. This is all you, though. This is Tom Esresco right here. Go ahead. Go.
So today we're going to be looking at an event that's often known, that a lot of historians look at, and they call it a precursor to the United States Civil War. And it's probably a very one-sided military conflict, very controversial, like the Mexican-American War. We're going to take an in-depth look at today.
Yes. Not to be confused with the Spanish-American War, which oftentimes is confused, specifically by my students. Whenever it's kind of like interchangeable for them. Whenever I speak about the Spanish-American War, they think I'm talking about the Mexican-American War and vice versa.
Well, that shouldn't happen. If you had a better teacher, that wouldn't be a problem.
You know what? I concur. I really do think maybe I need to change my profession here.
Yeah, maybe.
Let's talk about the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican-American War takes place in 1846, and it lasts technically till 1848. However, the real fighting more or less is over way before the 2-year mark.
That's just when the treaty is signed, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the real fighting really takes place over months. And in those few months, the United States, I hate to say, but I guess more or less, takes over the nation of Mexico.
Pretty much. It was the first armed U.S. conflict that was mostly fought in foreign soil here, North America, right? And it pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico. Mexico was not ready for this against the Polk administration, which was expansionist minded at the time and just wanted this land. They wanted all this land. We'll get into it more details, right? But he basically campaigned on saying, I'm going to expand, whether peacefully or if I have to, we'll go to war, but I'm going to expand. And Mexico kind of knew this was coming. We captured the capital, and they really have. Once you capture the capital, that's pretty much it.
The premise here is, and as you kind of mentioned it before, this really is a precursor, or almost like the first chapter of every book about American Civil War. Although it takes place 20 years before American Civil War, so many people that become central figures.
It's a who's who. It's a who's who of the Civil War, of American politics, right, and stuff like that going forward. This is I used to teach it almost as like the prequels to like the Civil War. If the Civil War is Star Wars,
come on, why'd you have to go with the prequels?
If the Civil War is Star Wars, like this is the prequels. This is the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones and all the other stuff leading up to it.
You just made this podcast uncool before we really started, Tom. It's 3 minutes in, and you just made it uncool.
Well, the prequels weren't that bad. If you watch the if you watch The Last Jedi, the prequels don't seem too bad anymore. But we're not going to get into that. We're not going. That's another podcast.
That's another podcast. Boom. Let's get into this. Basically speaking, I think to really start the Mexican-American War and start discussing it, I think we need to start with an ideology, and then we need to kind of start with another war and event that kind of leads itself into the Mexican-American War. And then afterwards, we're going to discuss the war itself, but then really the main reason why this war is even taught, I think, in American history classes is it's the effects of this war and what that means for the future of our nation. So the ideology I speak of is, you probably heard of this before, Manifest Destiny. And the idea of Manifest Destiny was actually coined 1845 by a magazine editor named John Lewis O'Sullivan. And he declared that it was our nation's manifest destiny to overspread the continent that was given to us by God. Manifest in this terminology means obvious. And destiny is the thing that we're meant to do. So this is the obvious thing we're meant to do. We are placed on this continent. And because of our sheer greatness, the United States has a mission to expand this greatness to those people that do not possess it. In other words, move west. And we're talking about subjugating Native Americans, but also in our way is Mexico, which just recently gained independence from Spain. But also there's the Oregon country, which at the time, Oregon, which was much larger than just the state of Oregon we have today, was jointly kind of not owned, but I guess claimed by the United States, Britain, and then Russia. Did you hear that?
Basically, the idea of manifest destiny, just to go back to that for a second, right? Like what you were saying, is that all that stuff was there, right? Other people had this land, they were living that land, but none of them could do it or deserved it as much as the Americans did.
Yes.
That's basically what it is. Like they had it, okay, but you're not using it right, and we need it, and we should have it because God, it's our destiny, right? God wants us to have it.
A lot of Americans started moving west, and Louisiana Purchase, which today would be like the central United States, was very much unfertile land. It was dry, it was deserts. So a lot of Americans started to bypass the central United States, which really was the westernmost border of the country, and they started actually venturing into lands that did not belong to us. And that's where you get into a lot of these Santa Fe trails, you get into the Oregon trails, you get a lot of these explorers that are just looking for better land, and they're crossing into lands, a lot of them to California, that don't belong to us. They technically
Yeah.
belong to Mexico.
Remember, this was frontier times. This was it's not like there was like signs and stuff like that or roads. So they're just going to this land, and they're settlers going into it, and they just say, okay, I'm going to settle here. I'm going to build my homestead, right? I'm going to farm this land, and there really wasn't anyone to say you can't because it's just land.
Yeah, there was a
So
squatter
until
laws.
yeah,
Yeah.
so until others started to come over, until things really started heating up, these people are just living there, and then years go by. A lot of these cases before someone realizes, no, you should. This you're actually in a part of a different country right now.
Yeah. It's
It's
crazy, isn't
just
it?
yeah, it's crazy.
For the most part, the belief was that the land a lot of these people settled in, specifically Texas, a lot of them settled in Texas, and some made it all the way to California. But those western lands were predominantly occupied by Native Americans. You have the Apaches, Comanches, right? And the Native American groups that are in these areas are kind of warlike tribes. Spain, which technically owned that land before Mexico got its independence from Spain, Spain allowed this to happen because the way they viewed it is that if Americans moved to these areas, they would create this natural buffer zone between these war tribes and Mexico, mainland Mexico. So they
Mhm.
kind of let this happen because they're like, you know what, if Americans get there, and they're not getting there within the numbers that are scary at this point yet to Mexico or Spain, at least the Native Americans will attack them first. So it's like a natural buffer zone. But then Mexico gains its independence. The most northern portions of its empire, when you're looking at Texas, you're looking at New Mexico, current day Arizona, but specifically also California, they're not necessarily occupied by Mexicans. They say that by 1820, for example, California only had about 3,000 Hispanic people living in all of California. I mean, think of the size of California, 3,000, that's nothing. And the reason for that is because no one ventured that high up from mainland Mexico because of the fear of these Native Americans.
So some of the things going on in Texas this time is basically the settlers are going in there. They want these land rights. Over time, just to speed things up, more and more of these Texans come in and they say, you know what, we should have more rights. We should have more power. We should basically break away from Mexico.
Yep. And these
And
Texans are Americans. We
they're
should mention
Americans.
that.
Yeah, yeah, they're Americans. They're coming in, and they're basically, and this is what, like you were saying before, Pete. They were all right. Let the Americans come in, let them settle in. But as the numbers grew, they started basically outnumbering the Mexicans out in this area.
Yep.
American settlers in Texas, they have a convention right in 1832, and
Hmm.
they asked Mexico to reopen Texas to American immigrants because it was
They
basically
banned it.
banned before that. Yeah, and this is the idea. It was to decrease the tax on imports and stuff like that.
Yep.
And it was they say no. They held another convention, 1833. That was much more aggressive, and Texas was part of the Mexican state at this point, right? So the
Yep.
convention members asked Mexico to separate Texas from the other Mexican states and create a new state, a state of Texas, but still in Mexico. And they wrote up a new constitution and sent Steve Austin, right? Not Stone
Yep.
Cold Steve Austin, but Steve Austin
Mhm.
to Mexico City to negotiate with the Mexican government. And those negotiations basically fail. And Austin writes a letter suggesting that Texas should organize its own state government. And then Steve Austin basically persuaded the president at the time, which is Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, right? Santa Anna
Mhm.
considered
Yep.
himself the Napoleon of the West. We'll get to him a little bit. To agree to lift the immigration ban and a lot of other demands too. And he did this because he knew that if he didn't, Texas was it was basically gonna start a war. What I used to teach it as is almost as Texas wants to break up with Mexico, right?
Yep.
It was a long relationship. It's not working out anymore. It's time to walk away.
The Mexican government, after they won their independence from Spain, as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast today, they were in a really terrible state. I mean, there
Yeah,
was political upheaval in Mexico City. They were completely bankrupt from fighting the War of Independence against Spain. They were completely disorganized. Their army was in shambles. Mexico was in no position whatsoever to not. We're not even talking about fighting war against the United States. We're talking about just fighting war against some ex-Americans that moved to Texas. You know
Like,
what I mean?
yeah,
They were
exactly. Like
no position.
Santa Anna destroys the Mexican Constitution, declares himself dictator.
Yep,
So
complete
that's what he does.
turmoil.
Yeah, it's just political turmoil, basically. Like, yeah, absolutely. Austin actually gets arrested, thrown in jail for treason. He gets out in 1835, and that's when he really starts to urge Texans to organize an army. You see, they said we're going to be fighting a war with Mexico soon.
Yep. And they do. On March 2nd, 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. And really shortly thereafter, you have Texas drafting a new constitution, and which basically kind of borrows from the US Constitution. But what's interesting is it's specifically as it's almost word for word for the US Constitution, the initial
Yeah,
one, but it almost specifically protects slavery, which was
that was
like
a
the
big.
big
That's a big difference.
huge difference. And that's also why Texans, these ex-Americans that moved to this Mexican area of Texas, they were under the impression that the United States was going to support them right away. But what really halted the United States Congress in their tracks was this provision in this new Texas Constitution that said that slavery will be protected. And a lot of people are like, "Ooh, that's like a hot potato. We don't want to touch that." So here is Texas essentially fighting their own, war for independence against a really weakened, barely independent new country of Mexico. And that in itself becomes a war. And I think that's a podcast in itself, but this is where you have your infamous the Alamo. Sam Houston takes command. Ultimately, Sam Houston defeats Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And
Basically, they capture Santa Anna, right? At
yes,
the
and they force him.
They force him. They basically put a bayonet to his head. Because Santa Anna tries to dress up actually as like a normal soldier after they get captured and like sneak away. And that part is true, but they recognize him. Actually, his own troops turn him in. They're like, "That's not a troop. That's Santa Anna." Like, kind of spare their own
Yep.
lives because they don't like him either. All right,
Yep.
a lot of the Mexican troops, they're not crazy about Santa Anna, and they capture and they basically want to kill him right there. But Sam Houston stops them, stops the other the soldiers, and says, "No, no, we're going to talk independence, and you're going to sign this." And so they basically he's forced to sign that treaty, which later on Mexico does not honor, and that's going to
Yeah, they
cause
don't
some
because they
issues.
said it was signed under duress.
Yes, and Santa Anna is no longer in power at that point either.
Yep. He does return to power eventually, though.
Well, we'll get to that. Yeah, because he makes a deal with Polk. It's like one of those. Like Santa Anna was a crafty. He was a crafty guy. Like he wanted power, and he was going to find a way to get power, no matter what he had to do.
It's crazy. So what we have here now is Texas finally gets a piece of paper signed that they are independent. At that moment, Texas become a Lone Star nation. They're not a state. They're their own nation. But they know they're not going to survive this because back in Mexico City, Mexico's like, yeah, no, you're not a nation. And Mexico is kind of, as a government, is trying to organize some form of a military action to get Texas back, which is why it becomes very important for Sam Houston to get Texas annexed to the United States. I mean,
yeah.
right away they're starting to petition, like, all right, please,
And
U.S., go ahead.
That's something that really angered Mexico too. Because again, it's how I used to talk about this. It's almost like the breakup, right? So Texas says, "Listen, I need some time for myself, right? I got to be independent. I got to be by myself." So all right, they break away. They become their own country, and within a couple of days, really, they're asking the United States to take them over, right? To be annexed by the United States. So if you put like the people thing, right? They break your girlfriend, boyfriend breaks up with you, and then a few days later they go and they're dating your neighbor who you don't get along with to begin
cool.
with. Okay.
Not
yeah,
cool.
not cool. So Mexico's going to be upset about this right off the bat, along with the fact that they don't think that they even should be independent.
Oh, as far as Mexico's concerned, Texas is
They
still,
still
part,
are,
of,
yeah.
part of
So
Mexico.
who are they now to say, "Hey, the United States annex us, bring us in"? But there's a lot of normally the Congress would say, "Yeah, we'll bring a new territory." Texas is
And
very
like, especially,
valuable.
we're talking a huge size, Texas.
It's a huge size, but they're against it. A lot of northern states are against it because of the issue of slavery.
Yeah.
And they do not want Texas to be coming into the Union as a slave state. Remember, this is the 1840s now, 1830s. And it's just that issue of slavery just keeps on being pushed to the back burner, and we know what's going to happen. But this is a really good example to see how it's never being totally resolved. It's just slight compromise here, compromise there, and it's not a way that's going to resolve anything.
We're not necessarily talking about all Northerners saying slavery's wrong. You shouldn't. No, that had nothing to do with it. We're talking about political power in Congress.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about. There was a certain balance, or rather, balance that's kind of slipping right now in the United States Congress, where in the House of Representatives, number of electors that you have from each state is determined based on population. slave states, for the most part, slave states, specifically old southern states, were not that populated. And they weren't populated because the people lived on vast plantations. And therefore, they would really have hardly any members in the House of Representatives responsible for making American laws. Therefore, initially in 1700s, they passed the Three-Fifths Compromise, which would count slaves as three-fifths of a person, but only when it came to counting number of representatives. And that's really the only reason that why the South had any decent number in the House of Representatives to make laws. Now, when it comes to states, up to this point, the United States really tried to keep a balance where there was the equal amount of states that were pro-slavery and equal amount of states that were anti-slavery, because from each state you had two senators in the Senate. So as long as the balance was kept, then it really didn't matter if there was no balance in the House of Representatives, because at least the South and the North were equal in the Senate. Now, if you bring in an extra state, that means you're bringing in two new senators that would be pro-slavery, which would upset the balance in the Senate. Therefore, if a law came up about expanding slavery or that was more pro-slavery, that potentially might have hurt tariffs that would benefit northern manufacturers, as opposed to, really hurting southern planters, laws that would benefit the South might potentially pass. And therefore, you don't want to have an additional state that's a slave state. It would upset that balance. So these guys are basically, no one touches this. They're like, yeah, we're not touching this.
Yeah, they just knew, like you said, it was just going to cause more problems than really what it was going to be worth. That's how a lot of people saw it. That there's no way we can just bring another state in, especially a state again the size of Texas. It's going to offset everything.
So in 1844, President Tyler brings the matter before the Senate. He proposes the bill to annex it. And then what he kind of blunders there, they say, because in this bill before the Senate, he includes a supporting document that is written by Secretary of State at the time, John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun was like an uber pro-slavery guy. And in this letter, he has this huge defense of slavery. When this letter, which was attached to this bill in the Senate to bring in Texas, outrage Northerners. They point to this letter as evidence that this annexation was nothing but like a pro-slavery plot. And essentially it is defeated 35-16. The Senate votes against annexation.
So yes, they decided it's not, again, it's not going to be worth the trouble. They're not for it.
And that brings us to the election of 1844, where kind of things start to change a little bit. First of all, Tyler, by doing this, by incorporating this letter from John C. Calhoun, angers so many Whigs that are mostly in the North that he has no chance whatsoever now running for re-election, right? So in 1844, you have a new election coming up, and you have a Whig, Senator Henry Clay is running as a Whig, and a former Democratic president, Martin Van Buren, was supposed to run. That was the idea. And both of these guys were being pressed by the newspapers and the media, like, all right, what are you going to do about Texas? Like, are you going to take Texas in? Are you not going to take Texas in? What's the deal? And none of them were committal. They were like, because again, you don't want to upset your constituents. There's one guy that could care less. James K. Polk.
James K. Polk.
He comes out of nowhere. They call it the first dark horse candidate ever, right?
Yeah, Polk was just basically, he comes out there and he fell out says, listen, he believes, he's a big supporter of Manifest Destiny, right? Mm-hmm. He's a big supporter of expansion at any cost. And he's like, basically, I'm going to do it. So put me in power. He's the one picking a stand, right? He's saying, yep. You want to know how to stand on what we're going to do with Mexico, what we're going to do with Texas? We're going to take Texas. I'm going to make Texas a state. So if you want Texas to be a state, I'm going to be your candidate. Yeah. And he does. And he says that, and people do, because again, it's the idea that he plays off of that Manifest Destiny ideal that a lot of Americans have, that we need to continue to expand, that this is our chosen territory from God. So yeah, that means that, hey, God wants Polk to be president because he's going to continue the expansion, which is what God wants. So Polk wins.
Yeah. Polk wins. And in the most basic terms, I mean, it's a basic supply and demand. The more land you have, the cheaper land becomes in the United States. And therefore, the more accessible land becomes in the United States. And without land, ultimately, I mean, that's the beauty of this country, was specifically at the time, is that as opposed to England, where, you're on an island and there's hardly any land, here you can have land, and it's easily accessible and it's cheap because of the amount of land that is available to the American people. And in this case, by expanding, we're adding land, therefore cheapening the value of land across all of the United States. So people are like, yeah, let's go for Polk. So Polk gets Van Buren basically loses his Democratic nomination altogether, and the Democrats nominate James K. Polk, and as you said, he wins. He ultimately has these promises. First of all, he's probably one of the most successful presidents in American history when it comes to fulfilling his promises. As he's running, he goes, "Look, I promise I'm going to annex not only Texas, but I'm also going to finally resolve the Oregon Territory question in the Northwest." So, as I mentioned before, Northwest Oregon Territory is kind of claimed by Britain and us and a little bit of Russia, but really it's just us and Britain. He's like, I'm going to resolve that. I'm going to bring Oregon Territory into the United States. So now he's talking about potentially doing that, making a balance. He's not just going to bring in Texas. He's already saying, I'm also going to get us Oregon all the way up north. And to make it even better, he goes, I'm also going to do anything and everything in my power to buy California from Mexico.
He wants
And
California.
Yeah, he really wants California. Why does he
He
want
want
California?
he's all the resource and stuff, but he wants to have that. What later becomes the song, right? Sea to shining sea. He wants that east to west coast. He wants it to be that true transcontinental type of country. But he also wants all the valuables that you can be in California.
Yep. And again, if gold hasn't even been discovered, the key here is that we could then trade potentially.
Yeah, two ports, two coasts,
exactly.
two ports, and everything like that.
We could now trade with the East, and he wanted it so bad. And we have to, kind of, we mentioned
it's all monetary. Everything comes down to the dollar.
Yes,
so that's where they're seeing. How can we make more money? How can the country become more profitable? Well, having California, having Texas, having Oregon, that's just going to give us, like you said, more land. It's going to space out the people more, but it's also going to give us more trade opportunities. It's going to give us a chance to just up our capital.
Yep. And he's kind of got a good point here because, as I mentioned before, California is not really occupied by Mexicans. Even Texas, it's not occupied by the mainland people of Mexico. The people of Mexico still mostly live in more of the southern area that we know today as Mexico. I think before we get into how the Mexican-American War starts, I think let me just get Oregon out of the way.
Go ahead, finish up Oregon.
Yeah, I think I'll do Oregon and then we'll get into that. So the promise for Oregon, right? Polk takes a huge stance in Oregon, and he sends representatives to England, basically saying, like, with his big rallying cry, 54-40 or fight. Like, we want Oregon country, like all of it, which actually today, some of the land we wanted encompassed like Canada. But he sends them in. But at the same time, while there was, our ambassadors are in England discussing to really kind of get or buy Oregon, at that time, we start the war with Mexico, which we're about to tell you guys about. And that kind of takes England back a little bit. They're like, wait a second, hold on. Like, England's dealing with their own problems. This is 1846. They have issues with Ireland. United States is becoming a very much like a powerful military nation. They're fighting war with Mexico. So basically, England's like, all right, fine. They just negotiate with us, and they're like, oh, let's do it. And the agreement is between the United States that we and Britain, we receive all of Oregon south of the 49th north latitude and west of the Rocky Mountains. Ultimately, the British were guaranteed navigation rights on the Columbia River as the trade-off. So we didn't even pay them for it. Like, England was kind of like, oh, we got issues ourselves, and these guys are like fighting wars now. All right, fine. So Polk secures.
They weren't going to send troops over for it. Yeah,
exactly.
It wasn't going to be worth it for them.
Yep. And basically, Polk secures Oregon while he's not negotiating. He's really tipping the scales to war with Mexico. All right, Tom. So how did this war with Mexico start?
Well, it starts like kind of what you were saying. Polk he keeps on asking or offering Mexico money. He wants to negotiate a way to buy California and everything else. Okay.
Yeah, so but Texas, we should mention Texas. We do annex Texas right away. Yeah, Taylor's puts the paperwork in. So even during Taylor's, when he's leaving the presidency, he puts the paperwork in, says, we're annexing Texas. So when Polk becomes president, there's really no choice. Like, Polk's just like, all right, well, Texas in. We're doing this. And as you said, he's trying to send people to Mexico to buy California. And what happens?
So he's up to offer them up to $25 million, which is a huge amount, especially back then, to buy New Mexico, territories that would be New Mexico and California. And the Mexicans refuse. They refuse to even consider offer, like, when it's not for sale, right? So Polk ups the ante. He orders 4,000 troops under General Zachary Taylor to occupy the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. It's a region Mexico claimed as its own territory. Mexico replies by sending troops to the disputed zone. So now you have two armies based on each side. And basically on April 5th, 1846, the Mexican cavalry attacked a patrol of Americans. And then Polk would later use this argument that
American blood has been shed on
American shed
American
on
soil.
on American soil. Now you have
Yeah,
to go fight. Even though later on, a lot of opponents and historians argue that Polk basically kind of goaded the Mexicans into starting the fight. But
absolutely. I
nevertheless,
mean,
right on May 13th, 1846, Congress votes to declare war on Mexico by an overwhelming majority.
40-2.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
they do agree to go.
Yes, Senate votes 42. And this disputed territory, essentially, that he sends Zachary Taylor to, is a part of Texas. He sends troops into
Yeah,
Texas,
there we
which
go.
we just annexed. But as far as Mexico's concerned, Texas still belongs to them. So they're like, wait, hold on, slow down here. So when we send troops to this area
Yeah.
of the
To them,
northern portion,
it's an invasion. Why is the American
exactly,
army coming into our country?
exactly. And to us, Polk is saying, no, this is part of America. So it's this disputed area, territory, specifically between these two rivers in Texas. So as you mentioned, Tom, 100%, and I think historians don't really dispute that. Polk basically instigated this war.
They knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. And the war itself became known in the papers, even at the time, as Mr. Polk's War.
War. Yep.
He sent soldiers to Mexico, and, ultimately, Mexico, obviously you're putting soldiers near Mexican soldiers. Something's is bound to happen, and that's what happened. And he right away went to Congress, said, "You know what? We are on American soil. Mexicans attacked us. Boom, war starts."
Well, it's basically just take over the land and get to the capital. That's
Yes.
basically the plan is get to the capital. And as this is going on, settlers in California, right, led by John C. Fremont,
Yes.
basically have little trouble beating the Mexicans there. And on June 14th, 1846, they declare California independent from Mexico. So Mexico's like, what's going on? Texas says they're independent. Now California says they're independent, right? California calling themselves the Bear Flag Republic. And then just a few weeks after they do that, the U.S. naval forces come in. They take possession of California for the United States. Now California is basically under control of United States troops.
Yep.
And the Mexicans are fighting the Americans, and they're not doing very well. But Mexico is refusing to surrender. So Polk actually replaces Taylor with General Wilfield Scott. And we'll talk about this more, but when you're looking
I
at all
never
these
understood
battles,
that though,
basically Taylor wasn't going fast
because
enough for Polk. He was
yeah,
winning
but
these battles, but he wasn't taking the capital.
see, and what I was getting too from a lot of sources is that he felt that Taylor was becoming too popular. That all of the newspapers up north were saying
Taylor's
Taylor's
the hero.
victory after victory after victory after
That's
victory, and
part of
then
it too, absolutely.
yeah, and he was like, "Wait, hold on a second. This is my war. Like, I just got to California in like 2 months, right? My forces under Taylor, granted, are sweeping down south into Mexico, destroying everything in their path, and now Taylor's getting all the credit. So,
Remember,
what
Taylor
sources
becomes a future president from
he
this.
does, and he was afraid that Taylor might become the future president,
Yeah, so
which is
he
what I
does.
didn't understand because
Taylor becomes a president. Pierce is a commander in this war. He becomes a president, right?
Winfield
This
Scott eventually becomes a major commander during
right?
the initial stages of the Civil War.
Grant is fighting during this. Meade, McClellan, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall
Lee,
Jackson,
yep,
George Pickett. All of these guys are all. This is a who's who of what the Civil War is going to be, and they're all fighting each other. That's how they know each other. They're all from West Point anyway, but they all know each
yeah,
other. So when the Civil War starts, they're like, "Oh, I know his tactics. I know his
yeah,
tactics." They're just aware of one another
yeah.
because of that.
But this is what I didn't get. So, like if you go with that train of thought of he was afraid that Taylor was becoming too popular, and Taylor's like near the capital already when he gets pulled. He basically gets pulled and asked to go back to Washington D.C. to get a desk job. And Taylor's like, "Wait a second, I just literally took over this whole country."
He doesn't want him to have the glory.
But it's interesting because Polk from the very onset, when he was running for president, flat out said he's only going to run for one term. Like
Yes,
that
he
was the
did say
famous thing. He
that
goes,
was
"I'm
his
going to be a
famous thing.
one-term president, and I'm going to do everything I promise
Well,
I'm going to do."
people change their mind.
Right, I
You know,
guess, because if you think about it,
you
if
know.
he's afraid of Taylor running against him, Polk wasn't supposed to run. So I don't know.
Also, once you taste that power, and he's being, like you said, he was accomplishing everything he was saying. He was
Yeah,
basically winning everything that he said he was going to do. Why don't keep on going, right? If all you're doing is winning, why stop?
yeah. And I mean, Americans were very much pro this war. Initially, when Congress authorizes Polk to call like 50,000 volunteers, the enlistment top was like 73,000. Within like the first month, it's insane. As you mentioned, Taylor's about to take over the Capitol, but then he is fired, and he is replaced by a guy named Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott, who basically takes over Taylor's army, like battle hardened army. And I mean, I hate to say he marches into Mexico City, but like he kind of does march into Mexico. I mean,
Well,
all
for
the
the
hard
most part,
work was done.
yeah. Well, there was a lot of other things going on. Like there was actually Polk and actually towards the ends of the conclusion of the war, right, in 1847, Polk actually sent State Department clerk Nicholas T. Trist, right, to the border to
Hmm.
try to negotiate a treaty. And they did proceed really slowly at first. And then Polk really got frustrated and he ordered Trist to come back and end the talks. But Trist was like, no, we're actually making some headway. I don't think I should leave yet. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. So he actually disobeyed Polk's orders and stayed in Mexico, wrote a 65-page letter defending his decision to continue the peace talks. Polk apparently was like seething. He's mad. He's angry over all that stuff. He calls Trist a destitute of honor or principle, right? And it basically orders him to come back. But by the time he does come back, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was basically already struck, and Polk had to accept it. He couldn't just reject this peace treaty. And we'll talk about what this treaty was in a few minutes.
Yeah.
And as soon as Trist comes back, he's fired. He's fired the second Polk sees him. Says, "You're fired because you disobeyed the direct order." So again, like Polk almost like wants to keep this. Not I don't know, wants to keep it might not be the right word, but he has some interest in keeping this war going because it's just being so successful.
And I mean, his popularity is like through the
Through the
roof.
roof. So why end it?
Yep. And it's going really quick. I mean, months. We took over the entire nation in a mere year at most.
And again, this is not saying the Mexican army didn't fight well. We're not dissing Mexico
No.
here. They just were not organized. They didn't have the type of organization to fight off a country. And actually, like we talked about before, Santa Anna uses this dysfunction to basically come back to power.
Yeah.
He actually in 1846 he was in Cuba and he convinces Polk to allow him
back, to help
bring him back.
in power.
So he's on a naval warship. All right, he goes through an American blockade. No, they let him through, and then he lands like, all right, because he's supposed to take over Mexico and negotiate a peace treaty favorable to the United States. And instead, as soon as Santa Anna lands on Mexican soil, he just double crosses the Americans, organizes troops to fight off the invasion. So he's like, yeah, let me get back. I'll take over the country, no problem. People love me there, and we'll become I'll make a treaty with you. Instead, he lands there and organizes his troops and says, all right, let's kick out the foreign invaders. The Mexicans don't like him. He's a mortal enemy for his actions. What happened at the Alamo in 1836. But
yeah,
he still fails. He loses, but he convinces Polk to go back.
Nuts.
It's a political comeback.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is also very interesting because, if you guys look at a map of Mexico, I want you guys to.
It's brutal.
Yeah, like
we had no choice.
Look at all of Mexico. Mexico was huge at that time. We're talking all of California. We're talking New Mexico, Arizona. We're talking all of Texas. And then all of Texas, and then all of today's Mexico. Like this is
parts of Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Kansas are also involved in this.
Yeah, and like
it's over half a million square miles of territory,
and we control that for that hot second. We control it; it's in our hands. So often, my students ask the question, "Why didn't we keep it all?" And this is this very same question that was asked in the U.S. Congress. We did not want to be an occupying nation. We did not want to be an occupying force, and the conversations, Frederick Merck is the historian that wrote a book about this on Manifest Destiny and about the issue of War of Mexico. He wrote this like 50 years ago. But Merck's, thesis really concentrated on and analyzing these firsthand accounts from the congressional hearings. And what it ultimately came down to is that U.S. Congress, a lot of senators had a big issue that if we were to keep all of Mexico, or at least more than we initially kept, areas that actually had Mexicans in it, that we would be extending to them constitutional rights, and therefore
they become citizens.
Exactly, we would have to extend constitutional rights to people of color, and I quote, that's what was said in Congress, that they viewed Mexicans as people of color, and they're like, well, if we extend constitutional rights and make people of color in Mexico Americans, then that will lead to an uprising in the U.S. proper, specifically the South. Therefore, we cannot do that. So we decided we only going to keep the northernmost portion of the country due to the fact that the population of Hispanic peoples was really, really low in that area. And ultimately, we got our major prize. The prize was always California, right? And now we
got that. Yeah,
exactly.
And we get that, right?
So what's the treaty? Like, what's the deal here?
Well, it's
Because we don't want to
basically,
seem like the bad guys. We
yeah,
can't
we
be
don't
the
want
bad
to
guys.
make a bad guy. So we, like we said before, the United States gets California, or will become California, Utah, Nevada, most of New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Mexico, and then Wyoming. Mexico agrees to the Rio Grande as the southern border between the U.S., right, which still is today. And we do agree to pay Mexico $15 million for all of this, which is
Yeah.
it's a decent amount of money back then, but it's still nowhere near what that land is actually worth.
No.
And we also agreed to take over $3.5 million in debt that the Mexican government owed American citizens. So we'll also pay the debt that you owe citizens
Us.
from damages, basically us, right?
Yeah.
And it is a one-sided treaty for a one-sided war, right? Most of the American soldiers that die in this conflict don't even die. Over 13,000 died. It's actually had a very high morality rate because 79,000 soldiers took part in the war and 13,000 of them died. So it's a higher morality rate than
Yeah, but
even
what did they die from?
World War I and World War II. They'd mostly died from like malaria, dysentery, disease,
Yep.
basically from the
Disease.
invasion, not from battle.
Wait, how
That's
many
a little
Mexican
graphic.
soldiers died?
They said over 25,000
Wow.
soldiers and civilians. You got to understand, this is a country. This is a battle on their home soil.
Yep. Nuts.
We're the invading power.
Yep. So then the issue really kind of we now have half of Mexico. It is now ours. This is why we usually teach it as a precursor to the American Civil War. And we're about to win this war. Bill that's proposed in August 8th of 1846 by a Pennsylvania Democrat, Wilmot Proviso, because he comes known as Wilmot Proviso, but the guy's name is David Wilmot. What he does is he proposes to Congress this idea that any land that we do wind up getting from the Mexican-American War shall be closed to the expansion of slavery. And normally this wouldn't be a big deal. However, it passes in the House of Representatives. Actually, it passes overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives,
Yeah.
which proves to southern states like, wait a second, we really don't have a lot of congressional power here. And it is defeated in the Senate, but it kind of raises enough suspicion for a lot of southern politicians that the northern politicians are trying to prevent or at least slow down the expansion of slavery.
We got to say, Polk also didn't think that slavery was going to be an issue because he thought that the climate was too dry in those states,
Yes.
in the new acquired territories. He's like, oh, why do we need? Why they're not going to want slavery there because it's not going to. There's no
Yep.
point. You can't have the plantations. That was his train of thought anyway.
Yep. And Texas, Texas is admitted, and Texas is admitted as a slave territory. So we're still seeking some kind of a balance in the House of Representatives, but also more or less really in the Senate. And then something interesting happens because California doesn't have a lot of people living there until, right? Um,
1849.
yeah, 1949, which is why they're the San Francisco 49ers, and they have golden helmets. Aren't you surprised? I know something about
Yeah, I
sports.
was going to say I was surprised that you
Yeah,
made a
I'm
sports,
trying. I'm
sports
trying, bro.
reference there.
Look at that. Look at that. So in 1849, gold is discovered in California, and everyone kind of knows that. And it seems like overnight, California becomes one of the most populated areas in all of the United States. Like, it's crazy how many people go there seeking gold. And most people don't find gold. They actually find
No.
their fortunes by the fact that, like, they brought a cow with them, and people want milk. So boom, you're
Basically
two
selling
cows
to
in
those
town.
people, or even
Exactly.
the jeans, right? Jeans become
Yeah,
invented because
Levi's.
of gold. Levi's jeans, and Levi Strauss creates jeans out of the leftover tent material, right? And that's
Yep.
become they don't fall apart like the other pants. So here we go. That's how he makes
And they
his
had
money.
pockets. That was the big deal. There was
Yeah,
the fact that
pockets,
it had
the
pockets.
rivets and everything. A lot of
Yep.
restaurants open up in that time,
Yep.
catering to the miners.
So the question becomes now: California becomes, as a territory, is very much anti-slavery, and it is anti-slavery because the belief is that we're looking for gold here, and people were very upset that if let's say Joe, nameless Joe, I mean, I guess not nameless, his name is Joe. All right, anyway, so Joe goes into California and he works 12-hour shifts looking for gold, and he finds a little tiny nugget. He's super excited. And then let's say Biff comes to California and he brings with him 20 of his slaves. He sets up a beach chair, sits down, sips some pina coladas, and 20 of his slaves look for gold, and they find 20 nuggets of gold. At the end of the day, Biff is wealthier than Joe, and Joe's like, that's not cool. You can't bring slaves here. Like, everyone's out for themselves here, which is why California petitions to be added as a free state.
Free state. Yep.
But it's got such a large population, it further causes a rift. So now in Congress it's almost like the fear of before Texas was admitted is finally realized. It's in like, what do we do with all this land that we got from Mexico? Like, is it going to be free? Is it going to be slave? Congress literally blows up over this. It gets so bad that people literally fighting in Congress. Like, they had to bring in dogs. They brought dogs and they had them lined up in the front, in the House's floor, which is crazy, in the Senate even. And anytime any of the senators got out of hand, they would unleash dogs on them. That's how
That's how
politically
crazy it got. Yeah.
divisive North and South got over the discussion what to do with the land from Mexico, which is, why oftentimes it's viewed as the War of Mexico is what ultimately leads to the issues of what to do
Well,
with
yeah.
the
I mean,
land.
you can trace back. You can trace back the steps. It's pretty obvious. They're not They're not looking at the actual issue. They're not trying to stop the actual issue of slavery in some way or shape or form. It's just what we're going to do with these new states coming in, right? So you have that. You have the idea of popular sovereignty, right? That's
Yeah,
coming in
so
there.
what's
I guess.
popular sovereignty?
Well, that's basically the idea, and it was Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan that proposed it. Is that let the citizens of that newly created territory will decide whether or not slavery was permitted or not. And it was really popular, and it appealed to many members of Congress. Like, all right, one, it removed the issue of slavery from national politics, right? We don't have to deal with it now. Oh, the people are going to decide. Okay, they're going to decide.
Yep.
And it seemed democratic, so people liked it. Abolitionists, however, argue that it still denied African Americans their right because they couldn't vote on it to be enslaved, right? And
Yep.
that Midwesterners like popular sovereignty because they believe that mostly northern settlers would move to new territories, so that most of those states would basically be free. And that's
Mhm.
basically their plan here. And that's what they're hoping, but it's still like thrown back and forth, and it's all going to lead into the next presidential election, the election of 1848,
Yep.
which has Democratic Lewis Cass, where we talked about him. He
Mhm.
supported popular sovereignty. The Free Soil candidate, which was basically a lot of these Whigs, known as the conscience Whigs, they quit the
We
Whig
should
Party when
do a
Taylor
we
was
should
nominated.
dude, honestly, we should do a podcast on like different political parties. Like a lot of people are like, wait,
Bull
wigs? What are
Moose,
we?
Bull Moose, yeah, Whigs. But they basically join up with the Democrats because they want they don't want Taylor to be nominated because Taylor was also nominated. And they had Martin Van Buren, which backed the Wilmot Bill, right? And he took a very
Yep.
strong anti-slavery stance in the territories. And you had the Whig candidate, which was Zachary Taylor, who he just avoided the issue of slavery altogether. He didn't even talk about slavery.
Yep.
So
Which
you
is why he
have,
won.
which is why he won, right? Cass is saying popular sovereignty. Van Buren is saying get rid of it, right? We're not going to allow it at all in these new states, these new territories. And then Taylor's like, I'm not going to talk about slavery. Let's talk about something else. And they're like, you know what? Sounds good to us. Because again, no one wants to have that tough conversation. They don't want to do what needs to be done then. And this is why it's going to take a war, all right, 14 years later, that's going to basically
Decide.
finally decide this. And like we talked about in our previous, I guess we're doing these kind of out of order. One of our previous podcasts when we were talking about Reconstruction, which still doesn't get it right. You could argue we still don't have it right today. I get that, but like that's why you have the civil rights movement after Reconstruction. It's just a constant. Instead of fixing it when it can be fixed, it's just put in the back burner. Put in the back burner. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. But you have to get to it at some point. You can't
Yep.
just keep on putting it off. You got to cash the
Absolutely.
check. You got to cash the check.
And President Polk does step down. He does not run for re-election. War with Mexico ends officially, within 2 year period. Not really even 2 years. And definitely one of the most successful
As
presidencies
far as with his agenda,
as
I mean, I
far
know
as
a
his
lot of he's
agenda.
probably I
Yeah.
don't know he would go down as one
Or
of the
can't
most
no no,
well
but at least campaign promises. I mean, this guy's
campaign
like,
promises. He can check off the boxes.
think
Good.
of how much land he got for the United States. I mean, it's
Yeah,
surreal.
but yeah, oh yeah. I mean, yeah, they take half from Mexico. Mexico is still seething over this years later. When you can go look into
World War
World
One.
War One.
Yeah.
When I mean, again, they weren't. With the Zimmerman note, they were not probably going to engage at all. But the Germans knew. Other countries knew Mexico was still mad. So yeah, let's ask them. Hey, you want an alliance with us? Invade the United States, occupy their army, and get back the land you lost in the Mexican-American War.
Yeah.
Now, again, they still were not strong enough to do that in 1917, but
Yeah.
that
And just for
mindset was
context
still there.
purposes, for those of you that may not know this or remember this, one of the reasons we went into World War One against Germany and
The main
Austria-Hungary,
reason, I would say the main reason.
yeah, that was definitely one of the main reasons. Was German telegram note was sent over to Mexico saying that if Mexico, this is while the United States is not even in the war yet, that's stating that if Mexico enters and attacks the United States and basically signs a peace treaty or an alliance treaty with Germany, then Germany will help Mexico regain the land it lost during the Mexican-American War. And as you said, Tom, this is 20th century. This is World War One, and they're still talking about it. I mean, rightfully so, I guess. I mean, we really did steal I guess, you could use
You
the
could say
word
steal. I mean, it was a war, but it was like a provoked war. I mean,
Yeah.
this is nothing that, I mean, historians talking about this, but even back in 1847, a freshman Illinois congressman.
I was going to say,
you might know him, right?
me.
You might know him, right? By the name of Abraham Lincoln, took to
Yeah.
the House floor and he introduced a series of resolutions demanding to know the exact spot. He's like, all right, you're saying that they're, American
They're in the
blood
U.S.
was
soil? Yep.
So he's like, so he wanted to know the exact spot of the soil where that first scrimmage took place to see if it really was American soil or not. And Polk just kind of goes,
go away. Who are you?
We got other stuff doing. Who you go?
Yeah, Abe Lincoln, what are you doing? Go chop some wood,
Yeah, get out of here. Exactly. So, but, again, it's just a precursor too. You're seeing these names pop up that wind up becoming major names less than 20 years later.
Yeah, Abe Lincoln was definitely against this war. Yeah, 100%. And that's when he's not even really that known yet.
No.
All right. So, I mean, I guess that's our podcast on the Mexican-American War, not to be confused with the Spanish-American War, for they are different wars.
Yes, don't confuse them.
Do not confuse them. I guess this is one that's usually not known so much. I mean, I feel like
it's one that, well, again, it's one that's usually taught or usually gone over. I think people usually know we fought a war with Mexico, or they believe at some point. But if you ask them literally when or what actually took place, some of the characters involved they might not know. I know, but it's usually taught like we were saying, kind of as a precursor, as a precursor to the Civil War, kind of the effects and how this United States again gets a huge influx of land is from this war. And it's a war of expansion. It's a war of conquest.
100%.
Right or wrong, that's what it is. Yeah.
As always, thank you guys. Thank you for listening. By the way, my book is officially out now.
Oh, fancy.
It is, yeah. Devil 13, Murder, Redemption, and Forgiveness in Small Town, New Jersey.
I have an autographed copy.
You do have an autographed copy.
I had
you might know the guy that wrote it.
God.
So yeah, if you guys haven't picked that up yet, it's out there. Barnes and Noble, Amazon, anywhere else. That's it. I think we have actually something planned next week. That is a suggestion that we got from one of our listeners. So we're excited about that.
We always like those.
We always like those.
It makes it a little easier for us, actually.
It does, actually. We're like, oh, we know what we're doing next week. That was a good suggestion.
We steal them.
We're chugging along.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.